The winter that came to Astor Vale that year was the kind old farmers would still be talking about a decade later. A winter that froze the irrigation canals solid, buried the lower pasture fences under drifts taller than a grown man, and turned the short walk from the farmhouse to the grain silo into an expedition worth bundling up for as if crossing a glacier. Rowan Hale was 11 years old, and he was the one who found her. He'd gone out to the orchard at dusk to check the traps his father had set for the frost rabbits that kept raiding the root cellar, moving fast because the cold had teeth that night, sharp enough to bite through 2 layers of wool. That was when he heard it, not the thin metallic click of a trap springing shut, but something smaller. A whimper, half swallowed, like whoever made it was trying very hard not to. He found her wedged between 2 frozen hay bales in the old loft above the toolshed, a structure so rarely used his father had half forgotten it existed. She couldn't have been older than 7. 2 triangular ears, russet orange and dusted with frost, lay flat against a tangle of hair the color of autumn leaves. Her clothes, what remained of them, were fine, embroidered things, entirely wrong for a farm, entirely wrong for a blizzard. One sleeve was dark and stiff with old blood. Her golden eyes, when they finally found his in the gloom, held something Rowan would spend the next 15 years trying to name and never quite manage, not just fear, but the specific, ancient exhaustion of someone who had already decided that kindness was a story other people got to live in. "Please," she said, her standard careful and faintly accented. "Please don't tell them where I am." Rowan didn't know that a Vulpine Royal cruiser had been ambushed in the shipping lanes above Astor Vale 3 days before. He didn't know that half the planetary militia was combing the countryside for a missing princess, or that the reward posted for her safe return was more wealth than his family would see in 4 generations of farming. He didn't know any of the political weight balanced on the small, shivering girl in front of him. He only knew that she was cold, and hurt, and alone, and that the temperature was dropping fast enough to kill her by morning. "I'm not gonna tell anyone," he said, and meant it so completely that something in her seemed to unclench, like a fist finally allowed to open. "Come on! You're freezing." He gave her his coat first, the good one his mother had patched twice and would patch again, draping it over her shoulders before he'd fully thought about what he was doing. Then he brought her bread and dried meat smuggled out under his shirt, wincing at every creaking floorboard, terrified his father would wake and ask why half a loaf had gone missing from the pantry. For 4 days he kept her hidden in that hayloft. He carried blankets out one at a time so no one would notice them missing. He cleaned the wound on her arm with medicine pilfered from the cabinet, hands clumsy and careful all at once. He talked to her mostly to keep her spirits up. About the farm, the frost rabbits, how his father complained his sums were terrible but his instincts with the animals were better than most grown men's. She never told him her name. He never asked for one. It simply never occurred to either of them that names were owed. On the 4th night, militia lights swept the lower fields, sweeping the wide valley grid rather than searching this farm in particular. And Rowan understood, with the strange clarity children sometimes have, that this was his chance to return her properly, without anyone ever needing to know a farm boy had hidden her. He walked her 3 miles through knee-deep snow in the dark, her small hand gripped tight in his coat still around her because she'd refused, fiercely, to give it back. When they reached the tree line above the militia's search perimeter, he stopped. "This is as far as I can go without them seeing me," he said. "You'll be okay from here. Just go toward the lights. Tell them who you are. They'll take care of you." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight something fierce settled into her small face, something older than 7 years had any right to be. "I don't know your name," she said. "Don't need it," Rowan said, with the easy, unthinking generosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that most people keep score. "Go on. Get warm." She hesitated a moment longer, long enough that he'd wonder about it for years afterward, though at the time he simply thought she was cold and scared, and then she was running, small footprints vanishing into the snow toward the searchlights. Rowan Hale turned around and walked home to a life he assumed would go on being ordinary. He never saw the reward posters. He never told his parents. He never spoke of it to anyone. Not because he'd been sworn to secrecy, but because somewhere in him an 11-year-old had decided that some things you did simply because they needed doing, and talking about them would cheapen the doing of them. What he had no possible way of knowing was that as the young princess of the Vulpine Empire was wrapped in warmed blankets aboard a recovery shuttle that night, still clutching a farm boy's threadbare coat like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just tried to kill her, she made herself a promise with the fierce, absolute conviction only children and the truly heartbroken are capable of. Someday, she thought, when I am free to choose anything at all, I will choose him. She didn't know his name either. It would take her 15 years, 3 intelligence networks, and a stubborn refusal to let go of a promise everyone told her was childish, to find out. 15 years later, Rowan Hale still smelled like the orchard. It was in the collar of his work shirts, in the callous pads of his fingers, in the particular way he squinted against morning light while checking soil moisture readings on a battered handheld unit that was older than some of his employees. At 26, he ran the Hale family orchard and had expanded it into a modest agricultural cooperative that supplied 3 settlements along the Vale's eastern ridge, not wealthy by any galactic measure, but respected, and stubbornly, unglamorously his. He had never left Astor Vale. Not really. He'd taken a few off-world contracts in his early 20s, consulting on irrigation systems for colonies with soil half as good as his own. But he'd always come home within a season, restless in a way he couldn't explain until he was standing in his own dirt again. He didn't think much about the winter he was 11. It surfaced sometimes, in a half-dream, in the particular hush of snowfall, in the way he still flinched a little at malicious sirens. But he'd filed it away the way children file away the strange things that happen to them, as a story that belonged to someone he used to be. He assumed, if he thought of her at all, that the girl from the hayloft had grown up somewhere far away, in a life with no reason to remember a farm boy who hadn't even given her his name. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't learn how wrong for another few weeks. It started with a formal summons that arrived by courier drone, embossed with the sunburst and vine seal of House Ashvale Kestrel, the ruling house of the Vulpine Empire, addressed not to the cooperative, not to his father, but to Rowan Hale, personally. Mandatory attendance. It's a labor policy conference, his foreman, Dessa, told him, squinting at her own copy over his shoulder. Every landholder on the Vale Eastern Registry got one. Something about new trade agreements with the Empire. You're required because you're registered as primary holder. Rowan turned the invitation over in his hands, frowning at the unfamiliar weight of the parchment analog, the strange formality of it. Feels like a lot of ceremony for a trade meeting. Everything the Vulpine court does is a lot of ceremony, Dessa said. You know how they are. Wear the good boots. He did not, in fact, own good boots. He wore his least patched ones, a jacket that had seen better decades, and made the 6-hour transit to the imperial capital feeling profoundly out of place among delegates in tailored formal wear and gleaming diplomatic shuttles. He assumed he'd stand in the back of some conference hall, nod at the appropriate moments, sign whatever agricultural compact required his signature, and be home in time for evening feeding. He had no idea he was walking into the single most consequential day of his life. The grand hall of House Ashvale Kestrel had not been built for farmers. Rowan understood this within 30 seconds of stepping through its towering doors. Understood it in the marble that seemed to swallow sound, in the ceiling so high it made him faintly dizzy, in the sheer, overwhelming density of nobility packed into a space designed to make every person in it feel simultaneously important and utterly insignificant. He found the back of the hall, near a support column, and did his best to become furniture. He hadn't realized, until the herald's voice rang out and the crowd's murmur sharpened into something electric, that this was not a labor policy conference at all. It was the royal selection ceremony. He'd heard of it distantly, the way you hear of things that happen to other people in other worlds, the ceremony where Princess Sora of the Vulpine Empire, the most sought-after unmarried heir in a dozen star systems, would choose a husband from among the assembled suitors. Kings. War Heroes. The scion of the Meridian shipping dynasty. A decorated fleet admiral half again Rowan's age, his chest a wall of medals. Rowan watched them from his spot by the column with the mild, detached curiosity of a man watching a sport he didn't understand the rules of, grateful only that whatever labor compact he'd been dragged here to sign could apparently wait until after the spectacle concluded. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Princess Sora entered, and the entire cavernous room went silent in a way marble alone couldn't account for. She was, Rowan would spend a long time afterward trying to find a better word than beautiful, because beautiful didn't touch it, composed in a way that read less like poise and more like armor worn so long it had become skin. Deep auburn hair, elaborately bound. Two fox-like ears that swiveled with faint, restless precision as she scanned the hall. A gown the color of a winter sunset. And golden eyes that moved across row after row of assembled nobility with an expression Rowan couldn't place, something between exhaustion and grim determination, like a woman walking toward a task rather than a celebration. She walked the center aisle slowly, past the fleet admiral, who straightened his medals hopefully. Past the Meridian heir, who offered a smile so practiced it looked engineered. Past kings who did not bow their heads to anyone but visibly expected her to bow to the moment. She kept walking. Past the front row entirely. Past the rope section reserved for the ceremony's official suitors. Down through the General Assembly, through delegates and landholders and confused agricultural cooperative representatives who had absolutely no idea why they were witnessing this at all. Until she stopped, directly in front of a support column, directly in front of a farmer in his least-patched jacket, and the entire grand hall of House Ashvale Kestrel turned as one body to stare at Rowan Hale. Sora looked at him for a long moment. Something in her golden eyes cracked open, hope, maybe, or fear that 15 years had been for nothing. "I choose him," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that vast silent room. Rowan looked behind him, certain. Certain, there had to be someone else standing there. There was no one else standing there. The grand hall did not remain silent for long. What followed was less a reaction than a detonation, a rolling wave of noise that started as a gasp and cracked open into shouting, gowns rustling as nobles surged half to their feet, the fleet admiral's face going through 3 distinct shades of red, the Meridian heir laughing once, sharply, in disbelief before catching himself. "This is a farmer," someone near the front hissed, loud enough to carry. "She's chosen a farmer over the fleet of the 9th Reach." Duke Calvin Ashgrave, silver-maned, immaculately dressed, a man whose family had held influence in the imperial court for longer than most star charts had existed, rose from his seat with the unhurried calm of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Your Highness," he said, and though his tone was silk, there was iron underneath it. "I must ask that you reconsider. This is, forgive me, an embarrassment to the crown. An insult to every house represented in this hall." "It is not an insult," Sora said, and though she was still facing Rowan, her voice carried backward to fill the whole chamber. "To choose the person I have chosen. You don't know him," the Duke pressed. "You have never met this man in your life." Rowan, who had until this exact moment been operating in a state of pure, paralyzed bewilderment, found his own voice for the first time. "She's right," he said too loudly, his farm-worn accent jarring against the polished cadences of the court. "I don't, Your Highness. I think there's been some mistake. I've never met you. I don't know why you're—" "You have met me," Sora said quietly, and something in the way she said it made the shouting behind her falter, just slightly, into confused muttering instead. 15 years ago. In an orchard on this world's snowbound cousin of a farm, in a hayloft above a tool shed. You gave me your coat. You gave me bread you stole from your own family's pantry. You walked me 3 miles through a blizzard to bring me back to the people searching for me, and you asked for nothing. Not my name, not a reward, not so much as a thank you letter afterward. The hall had gone very quiet again, differently this time, not the anticipatory silence of a spectacle about to unfold, but the stunned silence of people realizing they were witnessing something they didn't fully understand yet. Rowan felt the blood drain from his face. That was you? I've spent 15 years trying to find out who you were, Sora said, and for the first time since she'd entered the hall, her royal composure slipped, just at the edges, just enough for Rowan to see the frightened 7-year-old still living somewhere behind those golden eyes. You never gave me your name. Do you understand how impossible that made it? An entire empire's worth of intelligence networks, and I was looking for a boy who never told me who he was. Duke Ashgrave's face had gone very still, a stillness Rowan, in his shock, didn't yet know to be suspicious of. Your Highness, the Duke said carefully now, each word placed like a stone. Sentiment is a fine thing for songs. It is not a foundation for an empire's most consequential marriage. It is the only foundation I intend to build a marriage on, Sora said, turning to face the Duke fully now, and there was something in her voice that had hardened into something closer to command than plea. I have spent my entire adult life being courted by men who wanted my crown. Every gift, every kindness, every practiced compliment in this hall has had my throne attached to it like a price tag. This man, she gestured to Rowan without looking away from the Duke, showed me kindness when he had absolutely nothing to gain from it. He didn't know I was a princess. He would have helped me if I'd been nobody at all. That is not sentiment, Duke Ashgrave. That is the only proof of character I have ever been offered in my entire life. The Grand Hall did not erupt again. It simmered instead, 100 private conversations breaking out at once, foreign delegates already murmuring to their aides about what this meant for their alliances, nobles exchanging looks that ranged from scandalized to calculating. Rowan stood very still in the middle of all of it, a farmer who had come to sign a trade compact and instead found himself, without any warning at all, at the center of an empire's crisis. They gave Rowan a room in the palace that night. Not out of hospitality, he suspected, but because no one in the court could decide what else to do with him, and locking him somewhere quiet seemed safer than releasing a farmer back into a capital city full of reporters who had already gotten wind of the ceremony's outcome. He sat on the edge of a bed larger than his entire bedroom back home and stared at his own hands, trying to reconcile the boy who'd carried bread out to a hayloft with the man who had apparently just upended galactic politics without saying more than a dozen words. The door chimed. He half expected a guard. Instead, Sora stood in the doorway, out of her ceremonial gown now, dressed simply, her ears low and uncertain in a way the golden-eyed composure of the Grand Hall hadn't shown. May I come in? She asked. Or would you rather I didn't? I understand if today has been a lot. That's one word for it, Rowan said, and then, because he didn't know what else to do with the strange tightness in his chest, he laughed, short and disbelieving. Your Highness, I really don't know what to say to you right now. Sora, she said. Please. Just Sora. I spent 15 years hoping to hear you say my name, and I'd rather not wait for a formal occasion to finally get it. He gestured her toward the single chair across from the bed, and she sat, folding her hands in her lap with a careful stillness he was beginning to recognize as something she did when she was working hard to seem calmer than she felt. Tell me it's true, Rowan said. Tell me you're really that little girl. Because I have spent 15 years thinking about that winter maybe twice a year, and I always figured she went on to some life I'd never hear about again. I thought about it every day, Sora said quietly. Not the fear of it, I mean I did, for a while. I had nightmares for years after the ambush. But mostly I thought about the hayloft. About the fact that you gave me your coat before you even asked what happened to me. My whole life since that winter, Rowan, has been men and women wanting something from me before they've even learned to say my name properly. Alliances. Trade concessions. My father's favor. You didn't want anything. You just helped. I didn't understand, for years, why that one memory stayed sharper than almost anything else in my childhood. I think I understand it now. It was the only kindness I ever received that had no strings on it at all. Rowan sat with that for a long moment, watching her hands, watching the faint tremor in them that the court's chandeliers and the day's public composure had hidden from the hall but couldn't hide from him now, up close, in a quiet room. "I'm not a prince," he said finally. "I don't know the first thing about running an empire, or courts, or whatever it is you people actually do all day besides wear extremely uncomfortable-looking clothes. I'm going to embarrass you constantly. I already have, probably." "Good," Sora said, and for the first time since she'd entered the hall that afternoon, something like a real smile broke across her face. "I have had a lifetime of men who knew exactly how to behave in a royal court, and not one single one of them ever made me feel like they saw me. I would very much rather have a farmer who embarrasses me by accident than a diplomat who flatters me on purpose." Your Duke didn't look like he agreed. Sora's smile faded, just slightly, replaced by something more guarded. "Duke Ashgrave doesn't agree with much that threatens his influence," she said. "He's held a seat on my father's council since before I was born. He'll fight this. I want you to understand that clearly, Rowan, before you decide anything. This won't be easy, and it won't be safe, and there will be people in this court who would prefer I'd never found you at all." Rowan thought of frost rabbit traps, of walking 3 miles through snow with a stranger's hand in his because it needed doing. He thought, distantly, that he had never once in his life backed away from something simply because it was hard. "I didn't hide you in a hayloft for 4 days because it was easy," he said. "I don't imagine I'll start choosing easy now." Something in Sora's face, relief, maybe, or the particular unclenching of a fist held tight for 15 years, told him he'd said exactly the right thing. What neither of them knew, that quiet night in a palace guest room, was that Duke Calvin Ashgrave was, at that very moment, 3 floors below in a private study, doing considerably more than simply disapproving. "The farm boy remembers nothing," the Duke said to the man seated across from him, a former intelligence officer named Petrus Vale, dismissed from imperial service 8 years prior under circumstances the Duke had personally arranged to keep quiet. "He has no idea what actually happened that winter. He thinks it was an assassination attempt gone wrong. A tragedy of politics, nothing more." "And if he learns otherwise?" Vale asked. "Then he learns that the ambush on the princess's cruiser 15 years ago wasn't the work of border pirates, as the official record states," the Duke said, his voice flat and precise, "but was arranged, at considerable expense, by a council member who found the idea of an empire ruled eventually by a headstrong, independent-minded princess considerably less appealing than the idea of a regency council with himself at its head, once her father's health inevitably failed and no clear heir remained to inherit. You tried to have a child killed. I tried to remove an obstacle," the Duke corrected, without any particular heat. "She survived. That was regrettable, but not catastrophic, until now. Now she intends to marry a man with no political weight, no house, no army, nothing to protect her should certain old questions resurface. A farmer cannot shield her from scrutiny the way a fleet admiral or a foreign king could have. If this marriage proceeds and she begins asking, publicly, who orchestrated an ambush against the 7-year-old girl, I would very much prefer that investigation to be led by someone I have some influence over. Not by a farmer with nothing to lose and every reason, once he learns the truth, to want my head on a pike." Vale considered this for a long moment. "What would you have me do?" "Discredit him," the Duke said. "Quietly, if possible. Publicly, if necessary. Find something. Debts, indiscretions, anything that makes him look unworthy of a crown, anything that makes the court's outrage look justified rather than petty. If that fails—" The Duke's expression did not change, which was, in its way, more chilling than if it had. "We will need to discuss more permanent solutions. I built a regency plan around that girl's death once already, Vale. I am not eager to abandon 15 years of patience over a farmer's inconvenient charm." In the days before the smears began in earnest, before either of them understood how much danger the palace actually held, Rowan and Sora spent what time they could steal from the court's endless obligations simply learning who the other person had become in the 15 years since a hayloft. She asked him about the orchard first, not the polite, distant questions of someone making conversation, but genuine curiosity, the kind that wanted specifics. What did frost rabbits actually look like? How did you know when fruit was ready before the sensors confirmed it? Why had he never left the Vale for good, when off-world consulting clearly paid better? Because the dirt's mine, he told her, turning a fallen leaf over in his fingers as they walked one of the palace's quieter garden paths. Sounds strange, maybe, to someone raised in all this. He gestured vaguely at marble and gold leaf. But there's something about knowing exactly which acre needs which kind of care, season after season, year after year. I like watching things I've tended actually grow. Consulting jobs, you fix someone's problem and you leave before you ever see if it worked. That's not strange, Sora said. That's the first honest description of contentment I think I've ever heard from anyone in this palace. He asked her, in turn, about the years he'd missed. Not the political education, which she waved off as tedious, but what it had actually felt like to grow up as the single most valuable unmarried heir in the empire, courted before she was old enough to understand what courtship even meant. Lonely, she admitted, the word coming out smaller than he expected from someone who commanded a room the way she had at the selection ceremony. Every friendship I made, I had to wonder about. Every gift, every compliment. I used to test people sometimes. Say something deliberately unflattering about myself, and watch whether they agreed with me honestly or rushed to contradict me because contradicting a princess felt safer than honesty. Almost everyone rushed to contradict me. You were the only person who ever just told me the truth, plainly, without calculating what it would cost you first. I didn't know I was talking to a princess, Rowan pointed out. I know, Sora said. That's exactly why it mattered. They did not, in those early days, speak much of the ambush itself, not out of avoidance, but because there was so much ordinary ground still to cover first, 15 years of separate lives to trade back and forth in small pieces. Rowan learned that she hated formal dinners and loved, secretly, the loud chaotic energy of the capital's open-air markets, where no one recognized her quickly enough to stop being themselves around her. Sora learned that he never once, in his entire life, been off-world for longer than 4 months before homesickness for his own soil dragged him back. He learned she still had nightmares sometimes about cold. She learned he still couldn't walk past a hayloft, any hayloft, anywhere, without a small unbidden flicker of memory. It was in those quiet, unhurried weeks, before poison, before Duke Ashgrave's arrest, before any of the danger that would follow, that whatever had been planted 15 years earlier in a Vulpine child's grateful, frightened heart finally had the chance to grow into something neither of them needed a promise to explain anymore. The stories began within a week. Rowan first heard about them from Dessa, who cummed him at an hour that told him immediately something was wrong before she'd said a single word. There's a piece running on the Imperial news feeds, she said. Claims you've got outstanding debts to a co-op supplier out past the Eastern Ridge. Says you falsified yield reports 2 seasons back to secure a better loan rate. That's not true, Rowan said. None of that is true. I've never even worked with the supplier they're naming. I know that, Dessa said. Anyone who's actually looked at your books for 5 minutes would know that. But it's running anyway. And it's running on channels with a lot more reach than our little corner of the Vale ever gets. It was the first of many. A story alleging he'd been in a bar fight that left a man hospitalized, time-stamped for a night Rowan had actually spent alone doing irrigation maintenance, which he could prove with equipment logs but which the story ran anyway, retraction buried 3 days later on a back page no one read. A supposed former partner claiming he'd broken an engagement callously years ago. A woman Rowan had never once met, in a town he'd never visited. Each story alone might have been dismissed as noise. Together, deployed with careful timing across the weeks following the selection ceremony, they built a portrait of a man unworthy of the trust a princess had placed in him, dishonest, unstable, undeserving. Sora found him in the palace gardens one evening, sitting on a stone bench with his head in his hands, a data tablet full of the week's fresh headlines discarded beside him. "They're lying," he said without looking up. "Every single one of these is a lie, and I don't know how to prove a negative to a whole galaxy that's already decided what kind of man I am." Sora sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his. "I know they're lies," she said. "I had my own people verify every claim within hours of it running. Your equipment logs check out. The supplier you supposedly cheated has never had a business relationship with your cooperative. The woman claiming a broken engagement doesn't exist in any registry on this world or the one you supposedly courted her on. Doesn't matter if it's true," Rowan said. "It matters what people believe. And right now half this empire believes their princess chose a liar and a cheat over the fleet admiral of the Ninth Reach. Then we prove them wrong," Sora said. "Not by hiding from it. By showing them who you actually are, in a way no fabricated headline can undo." Rowan looked at her, something wary in his expression. "You have a plan." "I have several," Sora said, and there was steel in her voice now, the particular steel of a woman who had grown up watching people underestimate her, and had learned exactly how to use that. "But first, I want to know something honestly, Rowan. Do you regret this? Any of it? You can tell me if you do. I would rather know now." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over gardens designed for royalty, thinking of an orchard designed for nothing but growing fruit, thinking of a hayloft, and a coat, and a promise he hadn't even known he made until 15 years later a stranger walked the length of a grand hall to keep it for him. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. I just wasn't ready for how hard people would fight to make me feel like I don't belong here." "Welcome to my whole life," Sora said, not unkindly, and something in the shared, rueful honesty of it made Rowan laugh despite himself, the first real laugh he'd managed in days. Sora's plan, it turned out, began not with public relations but with archives. "If someone is investing this much effort into discrediting you," she told Rowan over a late dinner either of them had much appetite for, "it isn't only about wounded court pride. Nobles grumble. They don't usually orchestrate coordinated smear campaigns with this much resourcing behind them. Someone is protecting something, and I think I know who, and I think I know what." She had spent 3 days quietly pulling records, shipping manifests, militia deployment logs, the original ambush investigation from 15 years prior, official documents that had been sealed under her father's authority, and, as far as she could tell, never seriously re-examined since. "The official record says pirates ambushed my convoy," she said. "Opportunistic border raiders who happened to know exactly which cruiser I was on, exactly which lane it would take, and exactly when my usual security detail had been reassigned to a decoy vessel 3 systems away. Pirates who, notably, were never caught, never identified, and whose weapon signatures, according to a forensics report that was filed and then never followed up on, matched military-grade ordnance far beyond what any border raiding operation of that era could have afforded." Rowan set down his fork. "You think someone in the court arranged it. I think someone in the court benefited enormously from a Regency Council forming around a dead princess with no heir," Sora said. "And I think that same person has spent 15 years making sure nobody asked too many questions, and is now considerably alarmed that I've married, or intend to marry, someone with absolutely no political stake in keeping quiet." "Duke Ashgrave," Rowan said. "It wasn't really a question. I can't prove it yet," Sora said. "But every thread I pull leads back toward his old allies, his old appointments, funding trails that dead-end suspiciously close to accounts he controlled 15 years ago. I need more before I can act publicly. If I move against a sitting council member without ironclad proof, he'll paint it as exactly what he's already painting you as: an unstable, ungrateful choice destabilizing the Empire for personal reasons. So what do? We be patient," Sora said. "And we be careful. And in the meantime, we let the court see who you actually are, instead of who his stories say you are. The turning point, when it came, didn't arrive through a grand political maneuver. It arrived through an accident of scheduling and a broken irrigation relay on a farming settlement 2 hours from the capital. Sora had arranged a series of public appearances meant to let the court and the wider empire see Rowan on his own terms. Not staged, not scripted, just present. The third of these appearances took them to Merido Hollow, a struggling agricultural settlement on the capital world's northern continent, ostensibly so Rowan could tour a cooperative facility and speak with local farmers about trade policy under the new agreements Sora's government was drafting. They arrived to find the settlement in quiet crisis. A critical irrigation relay serving 400 hectares of grain fields had failed overnight, and with a heat wave settling over the region, the local engineers, capable, but unfamiliar with a relay system 20 years out of date, were 3 hours into a repair that showed no signs of resolving before the fields began to suffer real damage. The royal security detail wanted to reroute the visit immediately, unwilling to have the princess and her intended standing in a field while a minor infrastructure crisis unfolded around them. Rowan, however, was already rolling up his sleeves. "I've fixed 6 of these exact relay models," he said, already crouching beside the open access panel, ignoring the alarmed protests of the security captain. "It's a bad fuel mixture regulator. I'd bet money on it. These old models run hot in summer heat, and the regulators fail predictably. Somebody hand me a torque driver." For the next 90 minutes, in full view of local farmers, startled royal guards, and a press pool that had been expecting nothing more exciting than a photo opportunity, Rowan Hale disassembled and repaired an irrigation relay with his bare hands, dirt on his formal clothes, sweat on his brow. Occasionally shouting for tools in a farmer's shorthand that the local engineers understood immediately, and the royal aides did not understand at all. When the relay hummed back to life and water began flowing into the parched fields, the small crowd that had gathered didn't cheer with the polite, distant applause court functions usually generated. They cheered like people whose crops had just been saved, because that was exactly what had happened. Sora watched from the edge of the field, arms crossed, a smile she couldn't have suppressed even if she'd wanted to spreading across her face as she watched a princess's intended kneeling in the dirt beside farmers who had, 20 minutes earlier, been openly skeptical of the whole royal visit. The footage ran on every major news feed in the empire that night. Not the polished, staged clips the palace's media office usually produced, but raw, unedited footage of a farmer solving a problem no court-trained noble would have known how to touch, surrounded by people who genuinely, visibly respected him for it. Public sentiment, which had been curdling under weeks of Duke Ashgrave's carefully seeded stories, began, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, to shift. "You didn't plan that," Sora said to him on the transport home, still faintly smiling. "Didn't plan any of this," Rowan admitted. "Not the ceremony. Not you. Not a broken relay. I just fixed the thing that was broken because it needed fixing." "I know," Sora said. "That's rather the whole point of you, isn't it?" The Duke's response to Merido Hollow was immediate, and considerably less patient than his previous efforts. If public smears could no longer dent Rowan's growing popularity, Duke Ashgrave reasoned, then a more permanent solution required accelerating. He could not risk this marriage proceeding to its formal conclusion, not with a farmer increasingly beloved by the Empire's common citizens and a princess increasingly emboldened to dig into records that had been quietly sealed for 15 years. The attempt came 3 weeks later, during a state dinner meant to formally introduce Rowan to the assembled foreign dignitaries whose alliances the court had feared losing. It was subtle, by design. A compromised food shipment, a poison calibrated to look like a sudden cardiac event rather than an assassination, timed for a moment when suspicion would fall everywhere except where it belonged. It was Rowan, of all people, who caught it, not through any court training, but through the same instincts that had kept him alive on a farm his whole life, the instincts that noticed when something in an environment was subtly, wrongly off. "Don't eat the fish course," he said quietly to Sora, midway through the dinner, his hand finding hers under the table. Something's wrong with it. I don't know what, but I've spent my whole life around livestock feed and fertilizer chemistry, and that dish smells like it's been treated with something it shouldn't have been. Sora didn't hesitate. She'd learned, over the preceding weeks, to trust Rowan's instincts about things that seemed strange to him even when she couldn't immediately see why. She quietly signaled her security detail, who moved with the practiced discretion of people trained for exactly this contingency, discreetly pulling the dish from service and rushing a sample to the palace's forensics lab under cover of a minor kitchen mishap explanation offered to the confused dinner guests. The forensics results came back within the hour, a fast-acting cardiotoxin, administered in a dose calibrated for someone of Rowan's approximate build, undetectable by standard palate or sent to anyone without unusually specific chemical familiarity. "Someone tried to kill you tonight," Sora said later, in the private safety of her own chambers, her hands not quite steady as she set down the forensics report. "Not me. You specifically. Someone decided that removing you was worth the risk of a public poisoning at a state dinner. Which means whoever it is," Rowan said slowly, "is more afraid of me than they are of you asking questions about a 15-year-old ambush." "Or," Sora said, her expression hardening into something Rowan hadn't seen from her before, "not fear, but a cold and focused fury. They've realized that removing you removes my reason to keep asking." Grief is easier to manage than a husband with nothing to lose and every motivation to find out who tried to have his wife murdered as a child. Rowan reached for her hand. "Then we stop being careful," he said. "We stop waiting for ironclad proof that satisfies a court more interested in protecting its own than protecting you. We find out who did this, and we do it now, before they try again and get it right." The investigation moved quickly once Sora stopped being careful. She brought the poisoning directly to her father, Emperor Talon Ashvale Kestrel, a man who had ruled for 30 years with a gentleness the court often mistook for weakness, but who Rowan would come to learn possessed a quiet, patient shrewdness that had simply chosen, for most of his reign, not to spend itself on small matters. An attempted murder at his own state dinner table was not a small matter. "Show me everything," the Emperor said, and Sora did. The sealed ambush report from 15 years prior, the forensics anomalies never followed up on, the funding trails leading back to accounts controlled by a council member who had spent 3 decades cultivating an image of unimpeachable loyalty to the crown. The Emperor's investigators, working with resources and authority Sora alone had never possessed, moved with a speed and thoroughness the Duke had not anticipated. Petrus Vale, the dismissed intelligence officer, broke under formal imperial questioning within 2 days, offering testimony in exchange for leniency that laid out 15 years of the Duke's careful architecture, the original ambush, the years of quiet consolidation of allies who would support a regency council, the escalating campaign against Rowan once the marriage threatened to place someone permanently loyal to Sora, rather than to the court's old order, at her side. Duke Calvin Ashgrave was arrested in his private study 3 weeks after the state dinner, still, according to the guards who took him, composed and unrepentant, insisting to the last that everything he had done had been in service of imperial stability. "You tried to kill a child," Sora told him, the one time she visited him in the holding cells before his formal trial, her voice level in a way that cost her considerable effort. "You tried to kill her because a princess who might grow into someone with her own convictions was less convenient to you than a regency council you controlled. And then, 15 years later, when that same girl found the one person who ever showed her real kindness, you tried to kill him too, rather than accept that your influence over this court might finally be ending." The Duke did not deny it. "You were always going to be difficult to control," he said, without particular malice, as though discussing an unfortunate but unsurprising weather pattern. "Your father indulged you. I merely tried to correct course before that indulgence cost the Empire its stability. The Empire," Sora said, "will be considerably more stable once it's no longer built on men like you deciding, in secret, whose lives are worth sacrificing for their own comfort." She left without waiting for a response. She didn't need one. The trial that followed was, by imperial standards, swift and thorough, the evidence overwhelming, the testimony consistent, the Duke's 15 years of careful construction unraveling faster than it had taken to build. He was stripped of his title, his council seat, and his considerable fortune, sentenced to permanent exile on a penal world reserved for crimes against the crown itself. What mattered more to Rowan, in the weeks that followed, was not the Duke's punishment but what came after it, the strange, quiet aftermath of an empire realizing that the story it had mocked as a farmer's fairy tale intrusion into royal politics was, in fact, the story of the one person in 15 years who had actually protected its princess, twice, without asking anything in return. The public sentiment that had shifted at Meadow Hollow solidified now into something closer to genuine affection. News feeds that had once run stories about fabricated debts now ran retrospectives on the irrigation relay, on the poisoning Rowan had caught through nothing but farm instinct, on the 15-year-old act of quiet kindness that had started all of it. Nobles who had sneered at the selection ceremony began, carefully and with varying degrees of sincerity, to court Rowan's favor instead of dismissing it. "It's strange," Rowan admitted to Sora one evening, sitting together in the palace gardens where she'd found him weeks before with his head in his hands over headlines that had all turned out to be lies. "A month ago half this court thought I was some liar who'd cheated his way into your favor. Now half of them are asking me for agricultural policy advice like I've always belonged here." "You have always belonged here," Sora said. "It just took the rest of them longer to notice what I noticed in a hayloft when I was 7 years old." "And what was that, exactly?" Sora considered the question with the same careful seriousness she gave everything that mattered to her. "That you help people because it needs doing," she said. "Not because it earns you anything. Not because someone's watching, or because there's a reward posted, or because it makes a good story afterward. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people calculating exactly what a kindness will cost them and exactly what it might return. You have never once, in 15 years, done that math. That is not a small thing, Rowan. In a galaxy like this one, that might be the rarest thing there is." Before the wedding, there was one visit Rowan insisted on making without any royal escort at all, back to the farmhouse where he'd grown up, to tell his parents, in person and without ceremony, what their son's strange 15-year-old secret had finally grown into. His mother cried before he'd finished the first sentence, though not, she insisted through the tears, out of sadness. "I always wondered," she said, "why you asked me twice that winter to patch your good coat when you told me you'd lost it in the orchard. I never pushed. Some part of me knew you'd tell us in your own time, if it ever mattered enough to tell." His father, a quieter man by nature, simply gripped Rowan's shoulder and said, "Reward posters were up in town for a month, you know. Biggest one I ever saw. You never said a word." "Didn't seem like it was mine to sell," Rowan said. "Wasn't asking for anything when I helped her. Didn't feel right to start asking after the fact." When Sora visited the farmhouse for the first time, weeks later, she came without any of the ceremonial trappings the court would have insisted on for a formal visit. No guard detail beyond the minimum her father's security office required, no gown, just simple traveling clothes and an obvious, nervous eagerness that Rowan found unexpectedly endearing in a woman who commanded entire star systems with a glance. She spent the better part of an afternoon in the orchard with Rowan's mother, who showed her, unprompted, the exact hayloft where a small frightened girl had once hidden, patched over the years but structurally unchanged. Sora stood in it for a long time, quiet, running her hand along the same weathered wood beams, while Rowan's mother watched with an expression that had settled somewhere between wonder and quiet, fierce protectiveness for the daughter-in-law she hadn't expected but had already, unmistakably, decided to love. "He never told us your name," Rowan's mother said eventually. "Never told us anything, really. Just disappeared with extra bread for 4 days and came back looking like he'd aged a year in a week. He never asked for mine either," Sora said. "I used to think about that more than almost anything else. A boy who helped a stranger and never once thought to ask who she was, because it didn't change what he was willing to do for her. That's Rowan," his mother said simply, as though it were the most unremarkable fact in the universe, And in a way, to her, it was. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony that Sora insisted, over the strenuous objections of the palace's protocol office, be held not in the grand hall where the selection ceremony had taken place, but in the orchard on Astor Vale where it had all actually begun. It was a smaller gathering than imperial tradition typically demanded. Rowan's parents, weathered and quietly disbelieving of the life their son had stumbled into. Dessa and the rest of the cooperative, dressed in their best clothes and looking faintly out of place among the handful of court dignitaries Sora had insisted attend. The Emperor himself, standing beneath the same orchard trees where a farm boy had once checked traps for frost rabbits and found something far more consequential than he'd expected. Sora wore a gown considerably simpler than the one from the selection ceremony, and when she walked toward Rowan this time, there was no vast marble hall between them, no crowd of suitors to walk past, nothing but orchard grass and afternoon light and 15 years of a promise finally, fully kept. "I never thought I'd stand here again," Rowan said quietly, as she reached him. "Not like this. I thought about this exact spot for 15 years, Sora said. "I used to close my eyes during the worst of the court's politics and imagine it. An orchard. Someone who didn't want anything from me. I didn't let myself hope it would ever actually happen. And then it did, and it turned out to be even better than I'd imagined, because now I get to actually know you, instead of just remembering a boy who gave me his coat. For what it's worth," Rowan said, "I'd have given you that coat even if I'd known exactly who you were. Probably would have made it a nicer coat, if I'd had one." Sora laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind the court rarely got to see. And somewhere behind them, Dessa muttered something to Rowan's mother about finally understanding why he'd always insisted on wearing his worst boots to important occasions, and Rowan's mother laughed too, and the whole small gathering dissolved into the easy, unceremonious warmth that imperial weddings almost never had, and this one, deliberately, entirely did. A year later, the marriage of Princess Sora and Rowan Hale had become, across a dozen star systems, considerably more than a romantic curiosity. It had become a genuine, uncomfortable challenge to centuries of assumption, proof, repeated in news feeds and court debates and dinner-table conversations across the empire, that a crown's worth might be measured by something other than bloodline and alliance after all. Rowan never stopped smelling faintly of the orchard, even in palace hallways. He split his time, by his own insistence and Sora's full support, between imperial obligations and the agricultural cooperative he still ran on Astor Vale, now expanded considerably under new trade agreements he'd helped Sora's government design, agreements that, unlike most imperial policy, had actually been written by someone who understood what it meant to depend on a harvest. Sora, for her part, found herself less interested with each passing season in the court politics that had once consumed her entire identity, and more interested in the quiet, unglamorous work of building an empire that valued its Merido hollows as much as its grand halls. She kept, in a drawer in her private chambers, a coat far too small for her now, patched twice by a farmer's wife she'd never met and would come, eventually, to love as her own family. Duke Ashgrave's exile faded, over the years, into a cautionary footnote, the story most often told, when his name came up at all, being not of his schemes but of what had ultimately undone them. Not a court investigation, not a rival noble's ambition, but a farmer's stubborn instinct to notice when something was wrong and fix it, exactly the way he noticed, 15 years earlier, that a frightened little girl in his family's hayloft needed nothing more complicated than someone willing to help her without asking what it might cost. "People still ask me sometimes," Rowan said one evening years later, watching his and Sora's young daughter chase frost rabbits through the very same orchard where he'd once hidden a princess he didn't know he was hiding. "Why I never told anyone about that winter. 15 years of silence, and I never once thought to mention it, not even when the reward could have changed my whole family's life." "Why didn't you?" Sora asked, though she already knew the answer. Had known it, in some form, since she was 7 years old, and watching a boy give away his own coat without a second thought. "Because it never occurred to me that kindness was something you were supposed to keep score of," Rowan said. Still doesn't, honestly. Sora leaned against him, watching their daughter's small triangular ears swivel towards some distant orchard sound, and thought that if there was any lesson worth passing down through generations of an empire built too long on bloodline and calculation, it was exactly that one. Simple enough for a child to understand, and rare enough that it had taken a princess 15 years, 3 intelligence networks, and one very stubborn promise to find a single person in the galaxy who actually lived by it.